Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your Cybersecurity Series. My name is Vlad, and together we get to know more about cybersecurity and this amazing field. In episode 8, we are trying to answer an interesting question, which is how can we exactly identify who is behind a cyber attack? And what we see in the media is that sometimes the journalists, which are not very trained into cybersecurity, they tend to attribute a cyber attack to certain companies or countries really quickly. And we always see blaming Russia, China, North Korea, sometimes the US, especially if you are from Western countries or Iran, etc. Sometimes it's done a bit quickly in the sense that, for example, one of the investigators has identified that there are some comments in Chinese in a certain piece of software. And immediately the journalist will be like, there is a Chinese a comment in Chinese that has to be China or that has to be Russia. The reality behind it is a bit more complex, and that's what we are trying to tackle today. Before we jump in, just a short reminder on what we discussed in episode 6. Basically, yes, sometimes the attackers, it can be a country or intelligence services, but it can also be very different attackers. It can be amateurs, insiders, organized crime, etc. We had an example in episode 7 of Nigerian scammers who conned a French citizen of almost 1 million euro. But just to illustrate that it's not always about the big, powerful countries, sometimes it's really about individuals coming together and committing crime. To understand how we can really identify who is behind the cyber attack, we need to understand what are the steps and how the hackers manage to achieve their objectives. And for that, there is a model which is called the cyber kill chain, which decomposes in 7 steps what attackers go through in order to target their victim and achieve their own objectives. Their objectives being extracting data, stealing in company information, it can be also stealing money via extortion. It depends. The first step is always reconnaissance in English. I'm not too sure how we pronounce that, but the idea is to learn more about the target. So what they do is they scout social media. It can be on LinkedIn, for example, or Facebook, Instagram, etc. They will get to know more about the employees or their targets. Maybe they will find, for example, the head of IT or the head of finance, the guy who processes or validates financial transactions or invoices. If we are in the context of a financial fraud, of course, we want to focus on the guys working in finance. They will also get to know more about the company, its landscape, what are the tools that they are using. And that you can learn a lot from the job applications that you see on certain recruitment websites, because in the skills and in the details on the company, sometimes you learn a lot about, for example, they are currently hiring a SQL, so a SQL administrator, and that SQL already can give you sometimes information about the version or which type of databases they are using. And that's exactly what they do. Once they have built a profile of their victim, and of course they will select let's say the victim with the least awareness or the least level of defenses, then there is a step of weaponization. So let's say that I want to do an extortion and I want to steal money from a company by sending them fake invoices. Perhaps the weapon that I will use will be an infected an infected macro or just a computer virus, so what we call a malware. And this malware, I will craft it so that it will take into account the company profile and be able to navigate the systems or propagate on its own. Then there is the question of the delivery. How do I get my virus into the company's infrastructure, into my target systems? How do I get that? It can be email, it can be a share drive, it can be many things. In this case, for example, we will go with an email which is embedding a malicious attachment, which is the usual, traditional, very classic case. Once the victim receives this infected email, sometimes they click on it, they open it, a macro, for example, will execute. And of course, in the background, there will be a certain number of actions. The malware will, on its own, for example, open a new internet connection, create some files, copy folders, etc., etc. In step five, that's the installation phase, which is completely optional. Sometimes the hackers they want to stay a bit longer in the systems, and which means they will try to install a certain number of tools and create a certain persistence in order maybe to come back later on or to perform even further actions. The step six is the idea that having infected a system is great. However, you need to be able to give the virus some orders in order to say, okay, what are we going to do? Do we attack another machine? Do we try to propagate? When is the right time to exfiltrate the data? So at some point, you need to be able to send back some orders to the malware. And this is done by what we call command and control. So these are specific servers which are driving or piloting, managing all the viruses that the hackers have deployed. And finally, actions on objectives. The idea is that the virus perhaps remains silent for months or sometimes years. And at the moment they receive the right order, a bit like in the Jedi when they say execute order 66, that's the same idea. Basically, the virus will execute a list of predetermined commands and, for example, exfiltrate the data and then delete everything from the systems. So this, in a nutshell, is an overview of the different steps that hackers go through when they try to infect and target their victims. And the idea is that in each of the steps, they leave some traces, they leave some elements which we can analyze and try to understand who is behind those actions. Here we have this concept of the pyramid of pain. The idea is that in each of the steps we can find some artifacts. When I say artifacts, it's really from a forensic or from a defense perspective, trying to understand what happened on the different systems. So sometimes we will find, for example, pieces of malware. So that can be hash values. So we will come back to that notion later, but basically it's kind of the footprint of a software. We can find IP addresses, domain names, because of course, if in the attack you received a certain email, well, this email was not created on its own. This email went through a certain number of servers. Those servers, they have IP addresses, they have domain names. So these are things that we can collect and analyze as well to understand where this email comes through and also identify a bit more information. Sometimes we will learn about what are the, let's say, tips and tricks that the malware used, what are the vulnerabilities that the malware exploited, what are the tools that the malware embedded in order to, for example, elevate its privileges, how did the malware manage to go from a low-level account to an administrator account. So these are also techniques that we try to understand. And at the very top, you have the techniques and their objectives, so what we call the TTPs, so the tactics. Meaning, basically, if I come back to the previous slide, the attackers, always have a certain pattern. They always have a strategy in mind. And you can see that 7 steps, it's quite long. And it's not every day that they change their entire operational model. So the more you understand what they have done and what are the paths that they have chosen, the more you collect information, the more you can draw a profile. And if you manage to successfully understand what were the TTPs, so what were the techniques, the tools that they use, and all those artifacts, then it's quite hard for them to reinvent themselves because they have to change basically their entire setup. Maybe they have to develop a new malware. It's costly, it takes time, even for hackers. I mean, it's an investment that they have to do. So understanding the TTPs is really what's more painful for them, because once you have understood that, you can basically protect yourself. Also here on the slide, I have the concept of honeypots. Those are voluntarily vulnerable servers that the researchers in cybersecurity they leave open, and the idea is that maybe the hackers they don't know that this server is just a fake and there as a decoy, and they will try to exploit it as usual. And by leveraging the information and understanding the artifacts on those honeypots, we again try to harvest materials and understand their techniques and how they are successfully attacking companies. Once we do that, and that's really the first step, we can do what we call threat intelligence, meaning that if something happens in a company and if they are willing to share and communicate about it, we can all put together some information and build what I was saying, those attackers' profiles, in order to identify trends or patterns. For example, if you have the same group of hackers who have infected a bank in Brazil, and then maybe they are trying to infect another bank in Luxembourg, maybe their techniques are a bit the same, maybe they are using the same servers, maybe it's the same branch of malware or type of malware. And by using those information together, we can build profiles and say, well, maybe the attack in Brazil is coming from the same group that is currently trying to infect a bank in Luxembourg. And again, that's really about sharing practices across the industry to better protect ourselves. Here, I'm just showing you two screenshots of a platform which is called MISP for malware information sharing. And this is basically open source that was created by the Luxembourg authorities. And every time that you declare a cyber attack, you can actually import all of these artifacts that we talked about. So you can declare IP addresses, domain names, etc. And you can see, so the attacks are here on the right side in red. Sometimes one attack shares a lot of components with a second wave of attack. And that is really characteristics of certain groups. And that's how today the researchers are following up on the different trends and the techniques that are being used. Of course, if you are a subscriber from that platform, you benefit from all of that intelligence. And in your defense mechanism, in your security solutions, you can already implement some rules, some detection rules, or some blocking mechanisms to make sure that if something similar to that attack occurs or is detected, you can immediately implement the corrective actions. So that's how today we try to identify who is behind cyber attacks. It's really an ant job, so it's really taking a lot of time and resources to properly analyze and investigate each of the cyber attack. The idea is really to remember, this pyramid. Some artifacts are easy to identify. Sometimes finding the strategy of the hackers is a bit more work intensive. However, in the end, we are able to really pinpoint and identify who is behind the cyber attack. So the answer is not always it's Russia, it's China. Sometimes it's much more complicated than that. And hackers and groups of hackers, it's also something that is evolving. We will talk about that in further videos. But that was just to give you a first perspective. So don't fall for the obvious trap. It's not because a news article has said, well, it's China, that it is the case. Usually, the reality is much more complex than that. And groups of hackers are assembling themselves. They have their own tools, they have their techniques. And that's it for today. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed and see you in the next video.